my family and I moved to Madison in 1951. We'd been living up in the northern part of Wisconsin, and there were, at that time, were no meetings up there, at least that I knew about. And so it was a real pleasure when we came here to look up Madison Meeting, which met on, down the southern part of the campus, eastern part of the campus, I should say, in a great big house that had been a family house and was now used, I guess, by several groups, not just by the meeting. So that was my first introduction to Madison Meeting, and people that were there were Samples and Holes and Johnsons, Dorothy and Walter Johnson, and Mildred Ashman and her sister, Irma Duncan. And pretty soon the meeting grew quite a bit too big for that living room. And so we moved to the Baptist Student Center on I believe it's Mills Street. And we were there quite a while, but looking all the time for a place of our own. And so the next move was to 202 Monroe Street. And when we outgrew that made-over house, we got the house next door to it. When we outgrew both of those houses, we came to Roberts Court, into what had been a church for the first time. Otherwise, we had been just making do with the rooms that were in family houses. But this time we came to a church where there was a big enough meeting room and a basement that was finished off for first day school and so forth.
So
It's where we are right now, 1990. Mm-hmm.
You came to Madison then already affiliated with Quakers, or? No?
Yes, my first membership was in Des Moines, Iowa meeting, and then transferred here. But in the meantime, since college days in Iowa, I had lived in Kansas City, where I did attend meeting, and in New York City, where I went to the old, I think it's 15th Street meeting house. But then to Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, and was glad then to meet up with friends in Madison.
So you first found Quakerism in college, is that what I heard you say?
Mm-hmm.
And where was that?
Ames, Iowa,
Ames, Iowa.
Iowa State. Mm-hmm.
And what was it that attracted you to Quakerism?
It was recommended to me by somebody who said I had composed a paper for one class that indicated that I was a Quaker. I said, "Oh no, they're extinct." "No," he said, "they're not extinct. They meet every Sunday morning over in the Memorial Union." So I thought I had better go and find out about this.
And what did you find when you went there?
A small, silent meeting. Not a meeting even big enough to accept members, and that's why they indicated I should write to Des Moines. One of the Des Moines meetings, there were two meetings in Des Moines, one silent meeting and the other one not. And so I never actually attended Des Moines meeting. That was all by mail.
Nice.
Through my friends in Ames.
Mail order friend.
Yes.
But that experience in Ames was a significant one then.
It was like Madison Meeting, only much smaller. And when I visited in Ames since then, I've been back, and they are now a larger meeting, not quite as big as Madison.
Aside from
They've
your
grown.
composition, which exposed your Quakerism, did you come to Quakerism with any other religious tradition, or?
Yes, I had, as a child, grown up in a Swedish fundamentalist church, a splinter group from the Swedish Lutheran Church. Mm-hmm. But I had left that before I think I went to Ames. Mm-hmm.
And when you first came to Madison meeting, you mentioned some of the people that were involved here. Do you
Mhm.
remember anything else that would characterize the flavor of Madison meeting in the days when you first started?
Well, it was a silent meeting, and the messages at meetings certainly were, I hate to say attraction, that isn't just the word,
Yes.
but the messages were good to hear. And there were several social action things going. There always is, there always has been, there was always something to write to the government about. And American Friends Service Committee at that time transported a lot of clothing to other countries where needed. And Madison had a very active group of the people who contributed great barrels of clothes. And we sat once a week, a few hours in the morning, and mended the clothes, cleaned them if they needed it, and got them all packed up and ready to go. And that was an ongoing project which attracted people, really faithful people to that meeting who were from outside the meeting too.
Who were some of the people that were active in that?
Helen Groves, who was actually a member of the meeting, and it still is, and Dorothy Ludwig, and Betty Boardman, and Grace Hughes, and Agnes Hole. These were all women. I think the men did more of the transporting of the barrels and boxes. I don't recall any men coming to sew. They were probably all busy on a weekday at their work.
I just realized something. I want to stop for a moment.
Stan? Tell us some of your early remembrances of Madison meeting.
Well, I actually joined Madison meeting when I was a sophomore in high school. My dad came from a long line of Quakers, several generations back, but my mother didn't. So, and as a compromise, we were raised as Congregationalists. So I didn't know anything about Quakers. I'm not even sure I'd heard of William Penn in grade school even. And so the January of my freshman year in high school, Dad said, let's go visit Barnesville. And so I said, what's Barnesville? Because he hadn't really talked about it at all, and not very much. We had been getting the little blue magazine, Alumni magazine, but I never paid attention to it. So we took a vacation. We went to visit Barnesville. We got there on a Thursday, just before lunch, at about 9:30, and that's the day of the week they have the midweek meeting. So we went in and sat down the midweek meeting, and I had not the faintest idea of what midweek meeting was. They hadn't explained anything to me. We just went in and sat down. They knew, of course, but so I sat around for about 15-20 minutes waiting for the preacher to get up and start talking, and nobody did. And finally I figured out they were kind of meditating, so then I tried to get a little serious about it and get into it. But so that was my introduction to meeting for worship. I suspect a lot like many of the visitors attending our meeting these days, not really sure what they're going to get into it. Anyway, we decided I was going to Barnesville, and so my parents and brother and I started coming to Madison meeting, attending, and then the next year we joined the meeting here. So I was about 14, and wasn't really one of the meeting brats, but one of the meeting teenagers.
Could you explain what Barnesville is?
Yes. Barnesville is a Quaker 4-year high school boarding school that's run by Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative. They started the school back in 18 1935. So it has a very long tradition. My family members have gone there for many years. But it's basically, as I said, a 4-year Quaker high school, an emphasis on the Quakerism at that time, freshman through senior. And essentially it was a college preparatory type school.
Do you know
Yeah.
what the inspiration was in your family to, after not having mentioned anything about Friends, to
take us
take you down to Barnesville?
taking to Barnesville? Well, I just found out a few years ago that Mom and Dad had a big argument about it. And on the way to visit, one of them wanted me to go and the other one didn't. And after we visited and were on the way home, they completely flipped over, and the other one wanted me to and the other one didn't. But meanwhile, I was already
Sounds like a happily married.
yeah, well, they were very happily married, but they disagreed on that. And the upshot was that what I liked about it was the students were in charge of the study halls. The students had a very strong self-government in helping to run the student life in the school. And that's, I think, what I based my decision on. To go, we just had like a 2-hour visit of the school, but that was enough to turn me on anyway, on that.
And then the whole family started attending Madison meeting?
Yes, we started coming.
Was there an argument about that?
No, not really. Not really. Folks felt quite comfortable at that point in time with the meeting. Their comfort changed in later years, but at that time they were quite comfortable, and it just it kind of like felt like home, really. It has all the way along for me ever since we started going to school or Barnesville and coming to meeting here. Just a big family. Really.
Did you then leave Madison and come back, or have you been in Madison the whole time?
No. We joined in high school, then I came to the university here, got my degree, and at that time got married, and then my wife and I left here and worked at Barnesville for 4.5 years on the staff there. But we've maintained our membership continually from the high school year. My wife was a birthright Quaker, that is, she was born into Quakerism. So that our family life has revolved around Quakerism from the very beginning of our particular family. But after Barnesville, we were away from Madison for about 9 or 10 years, and returned to Madison 10 years ago, 1978. Part of that time we were still members of Madison, sojourning members, so to speak. And part of the time we were members of a local meeting, Green Bay monthly meeting up in Green Bay, until we came back to Madison.
1978 may have been 10 years ago once, but it's not 10 years ago now.
That's right. This last 2 years has been too fast.
Keeps changing.
Yes.
Shouldn't have done that.
What do you remember about the meeting when you came back from Green Bay? What impressed you about it?
That's a hard question. Because I'm not sure it was the focal point at the time we came from Green Bay, so I don't think of it in that terms. We came back to start up a business, and that was the focal point. The meeting was just kind of a side thing, helpful, of course. It was like coming back to home. As I said, we had been members of the meeting while we were gone for a good period of time. I guess the thing that impressed us was the size that the meeting had grown in the 12 years or so that we were away. We met a lot of the Madison meeting members through Northern Yearly Meeting when we were in Green Bay in Minnesota before we came back here. So we knew a number of the members, and of course knew a lot of people, Lora and Sapples, and quite a few people who were here when I was younger. The spirit of the meeting hadn't changed a lot from when I left, though the meeting apparently had gone through a tremendous change and upheaval in between the time we left and the time we came back. That was during the Vietnam era. And we had gone through a lot of upheavals during that time, and we missed that part of it. So it kind of settled down somewhat by the time we came back in '78. Social concerns were very similar to the ones we left. The AFSC wasn't quite as strong. They had a very strong AFSC office when we left. And you were talking, Laura, about the clothing in the basement that the women had worked on. My recollection is the basement of 202 Monroe Street being packed high with boxes of clothing. Every time you went down, there's those boxes of clothing sitting down there in the furnace room and all over the place. I clearly remember those. But the AFSC activity seemed to have had leveled off and dropped off by the time we came back. There weren't as many group or whole meeting or whole community peace activities as there were when we had left.
What was it like as a teenager when you first started attending Madison meeting?
I didn't interact a whole lot with the other young people in the meeting. See, we lived out at Blue Mounds, which was 30 miles away from Madison, and we drove in only for meeting for worship. And we didn't see anybody else the rest of the week. So there wasn't, only interaction was 1 hour a week, and so we didn't interact with the other young people that much. Most of the young people's interaction came more during the I'd say late high school, early college years, at the Young Friends activities, at the yearly meeting, and sort of thing. Though we did take part, of course, in some activities, and we knew the people. But
So you were a participant of meeting for worship along with everybody else. Was there any program for teenagers there?
No, it was just the. I'm trying to remember. I don't think we had Sunday school for my age when we were here. I don't recall that at all. And maybe if it was, obviously it's a blank to me now, because I sure don't recall that at the time. I remember, for one thing, we had a problem in the old meeting house. This was before they bought the house next door to it. It was just the one house. And there just was not any space to have Sunday school for it. They had 2 classes downstairs on either side of a curtain in the basement. And those were real young kids. And once in a while they would have a class in the kitchen, which is right next door to the meeting for worship, so you get that noise coming in sometime. But I don't recall having any first day school classes for me. I was getting that kind of education at the Barnesville at the time, so I'm not sure I would have sat in on these. I probably had enough during the school year there and didn't want any more during the. Of course, that's a good point, because during the summer was the only time I was here, basically. That's probably why I wasn't in Sunday school. Now that I think about it, because I wouldn't have had them during the summer and Christmas vacation. That's probably why.
Was there? I'm struck by this sudden packing up of the kids and going down to Barnesville with no forewarning. Was there a religious tradition in the family at all prior to that, or was this a chain of religion? Or?
I'm not sure all of the motivation that my parents had at the time. I'm not sure. I don't think they were happy with the congregational churches that we had been attending. They didn't really feel comfortable in those churches, and probably were still searching some. Also, the school that I was going to my freshman year was not at that time considered one of the best schools in the area academically, and Barnesville had a much better reputation than academically. So I think that was part of the reason, or a major part of the reason for me going there, because I know my mother was roundly chewed out by many of her colleagues. She taught at the school I was going to when a freshman. Roundly chewed out by her colleagues for sending your poor child away to school during the high school years. And she had a real battle to fight over that with her colleagues, but meanwhile I was just having a good time out there. enjoying it. So I'm not sure it was a religious thing that they sent me. I think it was academically, probably socially.
Mhm.
Because I'm not sure I was a pacifist going to that school, but the viewpoints and the attitudes and so on fit in with the way I had been raised, and so I came away defined as a pacifist anyways. So I don't know if that was really in their thinking or not.
Uh-huh.
But
What then the family started attending meeting. Was there you've already said there wasn't a major change, but what do you think was the attraction for the whole family then to start attending meeting?
Well, I think they were uncomfortable with the church that they were going to. Neither of my parents were particularly religious seekers, but they wanted something a little more less superficial than they were getting. I don't know how to put it any more than that, 'cause I'm not sure they were thinking about it any more than that at the time, probably. And it became a community, really, to them. Mom taught Sunday school, and Dad was active on building committee and was active initially with Lora on the Quaker housing project, and very very active in meeting itself. So they felt at home there. And,
That's one of the things I think we for sure want to ask questions about is the Quaker housing.
Mhm.
I'm not sure exactly in terms of time, but Laura, were you here for the start of Quaker housing when the concept?
Yes, it only came about in 1968.
Uh-huh.
And I assure you that Madison Quakers had no ambition to own $1 million property,
How did they come up?
but they do now, and will for the duration of a 40-year mortgage at least.
Uh-huh.
Well, it came about because the director in Madison of the Urban Renewal and Development Authority had some property, the city had some property in South Madison, which by their federal contracts, the city could not develop. They had to find a private developer. And I think they had sought for-profit developers, and nobody was interested. But he knew that Philadelphia Quakers had been active in providing housing for low-income people. And he also was acquainted with the work of Nat Sample as an architect, and he thought he'd surely like to have Nat Sample building go up in the land in South Madison. And so he put it to Nat, who brought it then to meeting, did we want to develop some housing? We didn't know whether we wanted to do that or not. But there were probably a dozen people who were interested in investigating what it might mean to us, whether it looked as though we could do it, and so forth. And so we took 6 months with this group of a dozen people, finding out just what all it involved, and finding out what the needs were for housing. Found out there was a need for low-income housing, definitely. And so that's how we happened to buy a couple of lots from the city. They had single lots to build 4-bedroom houses for low-income families under a section of the Federal Housing Act where they had to pay only $200 down payment, and then the rent that they paid then was applied to the cost of the house, so they would eventually end up owning the house. And but we did 2 of those houses, and they were both sold after some problems. where at one point we thought we were left with owing for these 2 houses, and we didn't have a cent of money hardly. But that went all right, and now, let's see, it would be close to 20 years later, one of the houses is still occupied by the same family that bought it. The other one has been sold to a different family. They're both still in good condition. A member of the meeting built them, and his reputation for building a good solid house is certainly standing up in those houses. But then they had a big piece of land that would be suitable for a development of apartments. And the outcome of that was that Nat Sample drew the plans for 72 units for low-income elderly people and disabled people. And that was opened up in 1973, so that's almost 20 years old now, and going great, and looking very good besides. The design was particularly good for these people because it's built in 6 wings. There are actually two buildings. One has 2 wings and the other one 4 wings. And in each wing, there on each floor of a 2-story building, there are only 6 apartments. So there's no great big long hall wondering whether you're going to get into the right door or not. And as it's turned out, each of those hallways is a little community by itself. That doesn't mean that they all function exactly the same. Some do. They're fast friends and they get together a lot. The others don't, but they know their neighbors and they speak to their neighbors every day. And people maybe in some of the hallways have outside interests that take them away from the building more than other people. But each floor of each wing of each building is a little community, and the people really appreciate that.
What has been the nature of the involvement of the meeting in terms of overseeing that?
Right from the start, a separate nonprofit corporation was formed, Quaker Housing Incorporated, and so with bylaws that prescribe that 2/3 of the board of directors of Quaker Housing have to be either members of the meeting or associated in some way with the meeting, some solid way. And then the other 1/3 can be anybody else. It's always been people in the neighborhood or people that had some interest in housing. And that's the primary connection right now between Quaker Housing and the Quaker Meeting. But the meeting is always conscious that there is this endeavor that bears the name, and are always helpful. Early on, the meeting members loaned interest-free almost $10,000 for the original seed money. And occasionally, early on, we had need to ask the meeting for a contribution, not a loan. Those loans were paid back, of course. But the meeting members individually and the meeting as a whole has given money every time that it has been asked to do so. And had also, one thing that was rather interesting that I at least never thought about at the time the buildings were built, when the contractor walks away from the job, there's an awful lot of spilled plaster on the floor and dust all over everything, and a few grease marks here and there. And every time we open one wing at a time in 2-week periods, and every time we opened a wing, meeting people came down the night before, because always they were working there right till the night before the opening. And meeting people would come down and clean up that wing, so the people had it fairly clean when they moved in. Also, the meeting does feel a concern, has through the years felt a concern about different individuals in who live in the complex. And if they are informed that somebody needs some special help, there has always been help available. And apparently the meeting looks forward to, and I know the residents there look forward to the Christmas carols singing every winter.
You were talking about the buildings being built well. You must have done a good job, because Hud inspected them all last year and could find nothing wrong with any of them.
Is that right? See, I don't have any connection anymore. I retired some
Yes.
years ago,
Right.
and I didn't know that. I'm glad to hear it.
Yes.
That is really something, because an inspector really, may not be earning his or her money unless they
That's
find
right.
something wrong. So if they
That's
go
right.
away and say it's all right, well, you know that it
Yes,
is.
they had a clean sheet. They had nothing on it. So
Good. Mm-hmm.
Are there any members of the meeting or attenders who are living there?
Right this minute, there is one, namely Ivan Bean, who is not a member but has been for many years an attender of the meeting, and he lives there. Another young man who attended meeting did at one time live there, and I'm thinking, and I do not believe any other people from meeting have lived there. Mhm.
Can you tell us about the solar energy aspect of that?
Well, some years ago, when was it in the mid 70s maybe, late 70s, and people got to thinking about conservation. At that time, we were still in the act of getting the thing going financially. We were never in financial straits, but there was always that sword hanging over it. It would be very easy to get into financial straits.
yes.
So I was thinking in terms of trying to save money on utilities. And I don't know when this idea struck my mind, but something suggested to me that Madison Gas and Electric might be interested in donating a solar system. And so when I went and asked about it, I was received with open arms, because they have a requirement to put a certain amount of money into conservation. And we were the first people who thought to ask for it. And that's where the solar panels that are now on the roofs came from. And it was a saving.
How
And
long
it
have
cost us not 1 cent.
How long have they been up there now?
I think they must have been put up in about 1978 or somewhere along in there, 79.
They're the same,
No, it was before 79.
they're the same ones that the original ones.
Yes.
Still there. They're still being used. So.
Oh, yes.
Mhm.
They heat or preheat the
Domestic. Huh?
domestic water
Mhm.
supply. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Great, I never heard that story.
So, are there other meeting projects that come to mind?
Well, not that I have been involved in. There is one thing about that particular project, and that is that it's the most ongoing of any of the meetings projects. We've had different ones. We sewed, forgotten what you call the garb that people live on the Sahara Desert. When they were in need for Palestinians some years ago, and we got a hold of yards and yards and yards of woolen material and made I don't know, hundreds of those and shipped them off. But you see, that project, then it was done and done well and came to an end. The other clothing project that I mentioned came to an end. And different things have come up that we've gotten involved in, and sometimes they've spun off into projects that it took in other people, which is fine too. Quaker housing really has gone on longer, and let's assume that it will go on for at least the duration of that 40-year mortgage. I should, since I brought up the subject of owning property, that was a little bit of an obstacle to get over
In
at
terms
the
of
beginning.
consensus.
We didn't really want to think we really wanted to own property and be a landlord. And the other part of that was that this came up during the Vietnam War, and we had to use government money for this. There was no other sufficient amount from any other source. And so did we want to use government money? And the answer to that really came when we were reminded by somebody to think in these terms. Isn't it wonderful to take almost $1 million of government money and put it into something constructive instead of
Won't
war?
explode.
And that made us at least all feel better. So we went ahead with it.
Laura, what do you remember about the Madison Peace Center?
Well, I remember sitting down there on University Avenue. It was a big storefront, wasn't it? It was the Madison Peace Center. And I can't think right this minute what I myself did there. Stuffed envelopes, I think, or something like that, because the Peace Center was developed by a member of the meeting, Chester Graham, and other people. And they did put out materials into the mail. But there was room there also for someone selling books that related to peace, and festivals were given there, and it was very well known in the city, and there are people still who remember the Peace Center and how it shaped up the consolidated a little bit the peace efforts in this town. Not all Quakers by any means.
It was a fairly large store too. It wasn't just a small storefront. It was an
No.
old large supermarket that the whole space was
That's right, it was.
remodeled at the time into
yeah.
that. I remember Harry Hamilton Jr. was putting up exit signs in the store, and we did some painting there and so on.
There are other people that worked in it, in advisory capacity and in the organizing of it that know more about it than I do.
What do you remember about Gene Boardman?
What do I remember about Gene Boardman? I remember he could play Irma Duncan's organ, or something about her organ that was a little different. And not everyone could play it, but Eugene could. Well, Eugene always was available for program material for First Day School or for the meeting as a whole, and well, I hesitate a little bit trying to think back. Gene was not a very noisy person. That I guess is the reason I can't call to mind immediately a lot of things that he was outstanding about in the meeting. But he certainly was faithful and one of the foundation blocks of the meeting, no doubt about that.
We've heard from others that he was considered a pretty weighty friend. His opinion was highly valued
Yes,
on tough issues that came from me.
that's true. Eugene Boardman was, as we say, a weighty friend, and well, we relied on him a great deal for his opinion.
Gene rarely spoke unless he had thought about something in great detail.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't just speak off the top of his head very much that I recall. It was, when he spoke, you listened type situation.
Mm-hmm.
one project that I've heard described a couple of times, and I think I remember you, Laura, talking about it when we had this reminiscence meeting, is the student cooperative housing project.
Yes, we did have, during the war, I guess it must have been. It must have been during the war that young friends in the meeting and students from outside the meeting wanted to live in a cooperative house, and they needed somebody to rent a house. And they would pay in their rents. They would reimburse the meeting for renting the whole house, and that's the way it functioned for quite a while. This was not always the same house, different houses, and the meeting had nice relationships with those people. We would be invited there for dinner. Sometimes we went potluck, I remember. And sometimes they were invited to meeting. As I say, some of them already were in the meeting. And they tried to run their cooperative as in Quakerly fashion. But of course, as in all student groups, the population changed a lot, and I don't doubt at all. It seemed as though I could see that they just got a nice running operation, everybody understanding what meditation is and what consensus is. When the few would move out, and they'd have new people to come in and be educated to the way that they wanted to run the cooperative. Finally, after several years, they approached the meeting and said, the particular group that was living in the house then approached the meeting, and they must have found money someplace. They didn't need us anymore to rent the house, and they didn't feel that they needed to be as much under the meeting's wing as they had been. They were still friendly toward us and us to them, but the meeting then no longer conducted their business. And that house, I don't know how it's operated now, but it still has a sign on the front of it saying Friends House.
Where is that house located?
That's on Johnson, West Johnson Street. Mm-hmm.
And when was that started then? Roughly.
During the war.
The Vietnam War.
Yes.
Yes,
Mhm,
Vietnam
yeah.
War. That's what I thought. Mm-hmm.
That's as close as I can come to it.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
What is your recollection of the working of the consensus process, or the conduct of the business meeting? Is there anything that you recall that was noteworthy about the business meeting?
About the Friends meeting,
Yeah,
business meeting, not
Mhm.
Quaker housing. No.
Mhm.
Sometimes business meeting has. Let me start that over again. Business meeting has always been operated with consensus stands on whatever concerns came before it. But sometimes people have not understood exactly what that means. One time when I was clerk, a couple, a man and wife, came to me and said they had expressed a different opinion several times in meeting, and yet they were definitely in the minority, and the meeting sort of steamed ahead and did what most of the people had recommended. And they came to me and said, just what does consensus mean? If you find you're on the losing side, you just bow out and don't say anymore? Is that what consensus is? Well, it isn't what consensus is, but I think probably it does sometimes work that way. It is my personal opinion that consensus only works perfectly, if ever perfectly, when the group of people who are sitting together are are experienced at sitting together and have for a long time and have worked these things out. And perhaps when some people have felt that they were not being heard, it may be that they didn't understand they had to be more experienced and get used more to feeding their ideas into the rest of the people. The other thing I've heard expressed about that is that some people are just naturally rather reserved and withdrawn, and they don't speak up at all. And it's interesting to me that several times other people have said, think about so-and-so is very quiet and never says anything. I don't think that we give her or him a chance to speak up in business meeting. So if there is a fault there with those people being not able to get their ideas in, at the very least there are people there who recognize that we should do better about drawing those people out.
Can you tell us about your year as clerk? What year was that? And anything you remember that stands out about that year?
I don't think we had any crises, otherwise I'd remember it better. I was, I did have 2 interesting experiences as clerk. I served 1 term and then I served 2 half terms. One time when it was desired that Joe Elder should be the clerk, he knew he was only going to be in town half of the year. And so I was asked then to fill out the time when he left. And the same thing happened when Eugene Boardman went to Japan once for half a year. And this was in the 50s, I guess. And the clerk's job was a lot easier than it's ever been since then. But I was thinking, Stan, when you mentioned that when you came back to Madison and you found that some things weren't emphasized as they had been, like the American Friends Service Committee, I can see through the years that we have a terribly important concern that we put a lot of money and time and effort, and people work very hard and almost everybody is involved. And I don't know if we wear ourselves out, but after a few years that concern is either passed into history or it's been a problem solved, perhaps. But then the meeting is quiescent after that. I think we wear ourselves out. And then after a while comes another concern that you just cannot turn your back on, and then the meeting is emphasizing that for as long as it takes.
Did you find that the meetings struggling over issues tended to be more divisive or cohesive for the meeting, or did it vary with the issue? You think about some of the issues that you've dealt with.
Yeah. It's been both ways. It's been both ways. And
For example, Quaker housing was a cohesive one.
that was cohesive. Mm-hmm.
Were there any issues in the Vietnam War area that were, say, divisive, or were we meeting cohesive at that time too?
A lot of things came up to express an opinion about during the course of that war. Overall, it wasn't divisive. I don't think that it was. Before that, there had been, before the state legislature, a bill regarding equal rights housing. And that was a little bit divisive. Not that anybody was vociferous in opposing it, but some wanted to go farther in the meeting's participation than others. And particularly, I think whenever we have been asked to make a public statement about something, it's very hard to get consensus, because some people feel we should be moderate and other people feel we should say it all. And that sort of thing in the past has been divisive, but now at this time I can't remember that we have been asked for a public statement for a long time. I mean, where you print it in the paper and sign the meeting's name to it.
Do you recall the meeting's response to Betty Boardman's trip to Hanoi?
Yes, there was discussion about it, and I myself never heard any opposition towards doing what they were going to do. I mean, what they were going to give North Vietnam and so on, and people were willing to explain the position on that to people outside a meeting that said, how in the world can you give things to the enemy? And that was not hard to explain because Betty Boardman and her crew explained it all well to us. I think we were concerned about her, herself, and concerned about her family being left here. That was not so easy to defend. But the meeting cooperated with that crew, gave them things that they asked for and money to buy medical supplies and so on, and also gave audiences to them, assembled audiences for them to speak to when they came back. And there were no lasting feelings as far as I know.
Stan, I wonder if your current experience as treasurer of the meeting now for a good number of years has given you a perspective on the history of the meeting and how it works. And you follow an illustrious line of treasurers.
Big shoes to fill, I'll tell you.
Yeah. What can you tell us about the role of treasurer and what you have learned about how the meeting works from that role?
Well, the treasurer by default ends up making a lot of decisions for the meeting, whether the treasurer wants to or not. As an example, somebody will call up and say, we've got an urgent situation now, we need some money to do this, and the treasurer has to decide, will the meeting likely go along with it? What's the meeting feeling at this time? Do we have funds for it? And so the treasurer gets put on the spot an awful lot like that and ends up making decisions for the meeting, and hopefully in the long run the meeting will go along with the decisions. And the meeting isn't always aware of all of these, but that's just the way it works sometimes. Quite often, though, the treasurer will use the kind of executive committee concept to handle emergency situations too. He will consult with the clerk, members of the finance committee, any other individuals who might have a particular interest in the subject at hand. So there's a lot of subtle control of the meeting funds that goes on that people probably aren't aware of, that needs to be done to keep the meeting moving. It's really kind of a fascinating glimpse of that side of the meeting, and you said there've been some very illustrious treasurers in the past to follow in that.
What I'm not familiar with who the illustrious past treasurers are.
Illustrious past treasurers. Well, were you ever?
I
Just
was
about everybody in your generation was treasurer at one time or another.
Took our turn.
The meeting was small enough that just about everybody was treasurer. Recent treasurers, Karen Holden, Nancy Sherman, Dorothy Ludwig, of course, was treasurer for it seems like a
Quite
long
a
time.
long time it was.
Very long
Mhm.
time. She was kind of
Mhm.
the, when you thought about treasurer of the meeting, you kind of thought about Dorothy
Mhm.
before you thought about anybody else. I think my father was for a year, and Dad
Mhm.
probably was.
Mhm.
And I don't know who was in the years that we were gone.
Stan, did you
Uh,
ever look back in the books to see what the treasury started with?
We have all the old books,
Yeah.
and I have gone back,
Mm.
looked at the ones in the 40s, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole month's activity is on one small page. You know? And now, of course, it's all computerized in several sheets, and to get it all taken care of. But yes, it was amounts $1 here and $1 there, and percentage-wise, it was a big chunk of the income in those days, and they were people were very frugal with the funds, as people try to be now.
Well, it's just occurred to me that we've never really touched on this in terms of this videotape. One of the things that's I've always been very impressed with in Friends is the total lack of emphasis on financial giving, or at least it's
On the individual
the individual,
tithing
yeah.
or anything,
Yes.
anything like that.
Um,
Yeah, well, this meeting is that way. Other friends are not that way.
mhm.
When we were, Kathy and I were members of a high-year meeting, for example, they tell you how much you should give each year,
Uh-huh.
based on their estimate of your income and their budget and all this sort of thing. But Madison meeting, as far as I know, has always just had the subtle box on the wall, and sometimes would, sometimes wouldn't let people know when money was needed. And it's always seemed that whenever there was a real need, friends would give if the need was made known. As an example, a year ago, we drastically increased this meeting's budget for on the social concerns side, and made it known to the meeting, and we came out right on the dollar at the end of the year with the increased budget. So there never seemed to be a problem. This particular meeting basically is a fairly wealthy meeting, as many meetings go. So there's not the problem with friends not having the money. It's a matter of whether they give it to the meeting or they give it to some other concern, I think. And then I suspect that's the kind of changes that take place over the year, the proportion that goes to meeting, the proportion that goes to other social concerns.
As a treasurer, do you ever wish that there was a tradition of more direct appealing?
No, because that has its own headaches. But and the meeting, as I said, the meeting has always had, at least in my memory, of course, enough money to do what it wanted to do. Of course, could always spend more, but it takes time to spend money too. And the budget we have represents the amount of time and activities that the meeting is doing. So, no, I've never had any urge for that sort of things. You get into other types of headaches that I don't think we want to get into in this meeting. Because once you start assessing people how much they should be giving, you start creating hard feelings. Then you have to know what their income is, and it isn't worth it. We get done what we have to do with the budget that we have. And the interesting thing is I don't know if people have talked much about the purchase of this meeting house yet. Right at that point in time, is that
It's been brought up, yeah.
it's been brought up? Well,
Not in detail.
in
though.
detail.
No, it would be interesting.
Yeah, this my wife Kathy was clerk at the time that this was being considered and was purchased, and it's one of the few things I've seen in this meeting where it was an instant consensus with the meeting, really without any discussion. There was not one individual who was talking about if we should buy it, it's how we're going to buy it. It's just instant consensus. But that's where it stopped. Once we bought it.
And everybody had different ideas.
Everybody had different ideas on how we should remodel it and how much money we should spend on the meeting house. And it's taken a lot of money to remodel this to get it to where it is now. And near the end of this, a number of people became concerned about the proportion of our budget being spent on buildings and building-related matters. So the result of that concern was 2 years ago we increased the social concern side of the budget. So we had a 50-50 split, building-related, 50% on social concern. Now it's heavier on the social concerns as our remodeling is tapering off and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of very bitter feeling. Most of that was while we were away from Madison for a few years, but we ran into it when we got back, and very bitter feeling about the amount of money that was spent on the remodeling of the meeting house.
Was it clear at the time this building became available that the meeting was looking for a place to move to? Or?
We had been looking for a place for several years, actually, but seriously for a year or so before this. There was a committee set up that looked at a number of different sites and buildings around here for purchase and remodeling or a new building or whatever. And the interesting thing on how this was discovered, I chuckle every time, because we had a Ron Lord was a caretaker at the meeting house, lived upstairs at 202 Monroe Street. And he was down at either the local supermarket or bank, Randall Bank, I'm not sure which one it was. Did his business and walking out and noticed a little 8.5 by 11 sign advertising a spaghetti supper on the bulletin board there for Shalom Church, which was the group that we bought this building from. And the purpose of the supper was to raise money for their new building. And so Ron started walking on home. And halfway back to the meeting house, it dawned on him, hey, new building. That means they're going to move, right? So he dashed back, got the phone number, dashed home, called the pastor of the building, said, oh yes, we're going to sell it. It's not on the market yet. And so Ron got the building committee together. It was the search committee. I was one of the members of that committee, together, and come down and look at it tonight. So he got us there, looked at it that night, and the next Sunday, we paraded the whole meeting down Monroe Street, walking down Monroe Street here to look at this building after the 11 o'clock meeting. Everybody came down, as far as I could tell, and looked around, and everybody was just, oh, great, yay.
Consensus was
It was instant consensus. It was just a fantastic experience, and after all the things we had been through over the years.
The things we had said we wanted most about a new location was it should be bigger than what we had, should be near the university, and not only that, but it should be as close to the same neighborhood as we were in as possible. This answered those three things.
Right. Then we had to worry, how were we going to sell the old meeting house? And it was like the whole thing was ordained, because we went through a couple of months of wondering and worrying, and then the group that actually ended up buying it was using the old meeting house for meetings, evening meetings. And we had put the for sale sign up on the door, and they saw the for sale sign, and from then on they bought both houses. It was a perfect setup for the group that wanted to buy the houses. So the whole thing just slid right through. And
What group was that?
I don't think we're supposed to say at this point, because they're trying to keep the location of the group
Okay.
not as public information. So
We can edit this out.
Oh, you can edit that out. Okay.
You just did.
I think somebody talked about it earlier.
Yeah. So, yes, that was supposed to be a
I recall.
confidential location. So, but it was really a tremendous experience going through that whole consensus gathering and decision making and ending up here. And then we bought the building, and a large number of people came down Saturday before. The meeting was going to be the next day. The first meeting here was the next day, the Saturday before. We invited Yahara meeting over here for the 11 o'clock meeting. Everybody came and cleaned up the meeting house that Saturday. Vacuumed, scrubbed, cleaned, moved, and it was just a real experience. And yes, I should say. We bought the building, there was a neon cross over the front door out there, and several of our members had a very serious reservation about attending meeting here if there was a cross on the building, a deep concern. So Jim Lund and I undertook to take the cross down on Saturday evening, and it was a wooden cross with the red neon tubes on it, and so I took a wood saw up there and we just started sawing it off at the base. Okay, and I got halfway through and I hit metal. Oh no, this is going to take for a long. So I went down and got a hacksaw and I hacksawed through that, and it took me about half an hour, 45 minutes to cut the cross off. And I commented to Jim at the time, Jim, if this thing grows back, I'm not cutting it off again. But it didn't grow back, so. So we stored the cross downstairs in the boiler room here for a number of years. It's gone since. I don't know where it went.
When I first moved back to Madison, I was in this building and there was a rummage sale here, and I think it was Friends at the time. Was there a rummage sale that they had shortly after they moved into this building? Or
I remember that.
yeah, maybe it wasn't Friends. I'm sure it was this building though.
Maybe it was when they were
That would have
moving
been
out.
83.
83.
Well, we moved in '82.
Must have
Wasn't
been
the summer
ours
of
then.
'82 we moved in, I believe it was.
Right, September,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah, September of '82 I think we moved in. So it would have been us. Maybe we were cleaning house because we had just about everything left from the old meeting house that came down. Except the curtains. I think we left the curtains there.
it
Do you
kinda weird.
remember the moving day?
Oh yeah, it's like ants coming down Monroe Street.
Tell us about the moving day.
I don't know if I remember much more than that. But, that was,
That pretty much
we
describes
moved
it.
on the Saturday, the day before we were going to have a meeting for it. That was the same day we cleaned up and moved, I think, all in one day, wasn't it? I think it was.
I wasn't here. I stayed back at the other place to make
Yeah.
sure, that when things got taken
Yeah.
out and so
Right.
forth.
And we had cars and station wagons that pull up there and load up and come down here and unload. And we had people at both ends, and it was fairly well organized. We had people marching down the sidewalk carrying things from between buildings, and it was probably the biggest event we've had with everybody working on the meeting house that we've ever had. Because everybody's excited about the new place, and they hated the carpet, but they liked the rest of the building, and things like that, The important things in meeting for worship, the carpet color, so. But,
How long did it take before they got full steam into renovations then?
we bought in '82. I think the first renovations started in the next summer, sometime, summer or fall, something like that. Because we were gone from '83 through '85. They were finished up the first renovation, and then they argued for a year or so on the second renovation. We were gone during that time. Thank goodness we didn't get involved in that argument. And we came back, it was all done. So it was all finished up by August '85, I know. Other people would have the exact details on that. I suppose the treasurer's records do. As a matter of fact, yes, because Karen paid the last check on that project, and that was just before I took over, so as treasurer.
Care to tell us how much money was spent in renovation?
Yeah.
Or is that not Quakerly?
No, that's fine. The meeting house has 2 mortgages, one mortgage for each of the renovations, and what were they? Something like both. I think they were around $70,000 each, something in that ballpark. So we spent about $150,000 in remodeling on this building. We paid less than that for both properties, the caretaker's house and this building. We paid 120-some thousand for, I think, for both properties. So we put a lot of money in this building, remodeling.
Was there structural
It's
changes?
70,000. I don't remember. I'd have to look again.
I don't remember.
Maybe it was 75,000. That's what I'm thinking. Somewhere between 75 and 150,000. Narrow part there. But it's
There were structural additions.
right.
I don't know if you'd say structural.
No, there were no structural changes per
changes.
se down
Oh.
here, except for cutting one doorway through for the new porch entrance way out there, which was part of the second edition. First edition was essentially remodeling this basement area, putting the patio out back, and remodeling the west end of the first floor, the upper floor. Then the second remodeling was basically everything outside the south wall, and a new entrance and parking lot as part of that. So
Do we have the space for an elevator now in case we can ever buy one?
supposedly there is a space set aside near the stairway. I haven't figured out where it is yet, where it would go, but somebody has figured out, and Nat has figured.
We
No, not
wanted
that-
a
that is
lift
it.
of
Yes.
some kind, but
Yeah,
that was too expensive.
yeah, a space for either a chair lift or an elevator, wheelchair lift, one of the two. But the sidewalk around the outside, the sloping sidewalk, was put in specifically for that purpose, and it seems to have worked out reasonably well. So there hasn't been any pressure to put in the indoor lift. So
You were thinking mostly of people in wheelchairs rather than some kind of freight.
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. We had one family had a young girl in a wheelchair in the old meeting house. She was in a standard lightweight wheelchair, manual one, for the first year or so that they were there, and then she was scheduled to get an electric wheelchair. And there's no way you lift electric wheelchairs manually. So at that time, the meeting put in the old meeting house, the ramp with the connecting passageway between the two buildings so that they could bring her in that way. And then when we bought this meeting house, we had to make a temporary ramp out the front door to allow the wheelchair to get into the building. So we've had, and now we have one attender, fairly regular attender, who is in a wheelchair. So it's been somebody from the beginning of this meeting house that has been in a wheelchair. So it's helped to concentrate our thoughts in that direction for the remodeling. Something that's easy to forget sometimes.
Want to shut down for at least a little while?
Okay.
Years ago, the state legislature used to open its session with prayer. And they asked in rotation all the different ministers in Madison to come and do the prayer. And so they approached the meeting too, to send somebody to open the legislature in prayer. And I believe that Eugene Boardman was the clerk then, but whether he was or not, he was the one who was sent. And so he led in a period of silence before the opening of the legislature. First and last time it was ever done, I think.
Probably.
How long did they go for?
I
Just
don't
out of
know.
curiosity.
None of the rest of us went, I guess. I know I didn't.
Yeah. Well, there have been meetings of worship broadcast on TV, not in this meeting, but there have been. You know, the Ohio Yearly Meeting did one in Wheeling, West Virginia.
In meetings like ours, I mean unprogrammed meetings?
It was an unprogrammed meeting
One
for
was
worship
that
on
I
TV.
saw,
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, it was on radio. One of the two.
I don't expect the Nielsen ratings ever. Okay.
Okay, what about the Ridgeway Quaker Center? What was it and how did it happen?
The Ridgeway Quaker Center was basically an offshoot of Madison Meeting set up to try and create a Pendle Hill in the Midwest. That was the definition that was used for many years. Eldon Kelly was director of it for many years, and of course knows the history of it quite thoroughly. One of the meeting members was released. I'm trying to remember whether it was early on or later in the Ridgeway Quaker Center. Anyway, basically, one of the meeting members had a piece of land out west of Ridgeway, Wisconsin. It was way back in the hills. You couldn't get to it except walking across other people's property. So he was having trouble selling it. He was also trying to sell some other land around there at the same time. So he donated 20 acres, I believe it was, to the meeting to be used for a retreat center. I'm not sure he had that condition on it, but that was the intent, from what I recall, for the use of the property. It's 20 acres of valley and a little bit of hillside. Beautiful. It's wild, unused, clear out in the hills. The meeting, and I wasn't here at the time, so I'm speaking from secondhand history on this part of it, but the meeting released an individual to help develop this concept of a Pendle Hill in the Midwest. At some point, it was decided to set up a board of directors to run this, separate from the meeting. And I was privileged to be on that initial board, that charter board. So it became a separate corporation. So it was a separate entity from meeting, much as Quaker Housing is a separate entity now. But this particular board, in this case, had to be made up of all members of or attenders of Madison Meeting. So it dealt with the spiritual aspects of Quakerism. So this board tried to develop the property. A number of seminars were held out there, a number of retreats were held out there, trying to emphasize the closeness to nature, spirituality with nature, and other spiritual issues. A small yurt, I should say a large yurt, was built out there, about 15 feet in diameter maybe, and 10 feet tall at the peak, maybe 12 feet at the peak. And to get to it, we had to drive out this long county gravel road, and then you'd park along the side of the road or in a parking lot of an adjacent farm. And then you'd have to trudge about half a mile through a narrow path, through a cow pasture, and through some woods to get into this 20 acres. And once you got into that, there were hills all the way around except for the west side, and that was a half mile from the nearest road. It was just quiet in there, except unless you had an airplane go over. But other than that, it was just quiet. You're isolated from everything, and nice and peaceful, and essentially just wildlife in there. Once in a while, a cow would get loose and straggle in, but basically it was a nature area. A lot of beautiful bluffs and a creek and so on. And this whole concept struggled continually from day one. We never had any money to do anything with it. Didn't have many contributions, though we didn't really aggressively seek a lot of contributions. We did one mailing, but most of the money was income during seminars. And we had seminars there. We had seminars around the state, northern part of the state, trying to take more of an educational role in Quakerism in this area. And it never really took hold. Eldon Kelly, as I said, was a full-time director for several years. And I think Elspeth Caldwell was a part-time director right at the very end, after Eldon retired.
Bimsey Kirkpatrick.
I'm sorry, Bimsey Kirkpatrick. No, you're right, not Elspeth. Bimsey Kirkpatrick. And finally, it just kind of fizzled out. Part of the fizzling, it fizzled out in about 74, 75. The oil crunch hit right when we were just about to hit our stride with the center, and everybody just stopped traveling flat. It was interesting. Nobody would come to the seminars because they didn't want to spend the money for the gas, or they wanted to save fuel because of the oil crisis, whatever reason. And I think that, as much as anything else, contributed to the demise of the Ridgeway Quaker Center.
What's happened to the land?
The land was given back to the person who donated it to the meeting in the first place. The meeting had no intention of making money off the property, and we had used it for a number of years, and just gave it back to the individual. And so it was a nice attempt at setting up this kind of center, but it just didn't work out.
The Friends have been, excuse me.
Yeah. One big problem, of course, was the access to the site. Anybody in a wheelchair could not get in. We had one winter meeting out there, and I forget the fellow's name, but he was, I think, a quadriplegic, and we took him in a bobsled. Rather precarious in and out of ruts, but he made it in and enjoyed it. And so, but it was difficult. Elderly people could not get into the yurt at all. There was just absolutely no way that you could drive into it. So that, and it just did not work out in the long run.
Is there any connection between that project and the I think it's called
Rock Ridge?
Rock Ridge?
No, there is no connection. No connection at all. One of the members, maybe two of the members of Rock Ridge, happened to be on the Quaker Ridgeway Center board, but there was no intent of connection. They were really two entirely separate projects. And, we were friends, of course, and walked across their land to get to it, and so on.
Do you mean it was very much in the same location?
Adjacent to each other.
Oh. Okay.
But it was almost coincidence, really,
Oh.
that they were there. But there really was no relationship at all between the two. Completely separate.